The public is being conditioned to look at the sky. News cycles are dominated by legacy threats, hypersonic missiles, carrier groups, and new defense contracts like the one secured by Innodata for missile programs. This is a strategic misdirection. The kinetic cost of a direct military strike on a superpower is prohibitive. The real vector of attack is not physical, it is perceptual. While capital is allocated to intercepting projectiles, the actual theater of operations has moved. Reports from industrial cyber confirm hacktivists and state-adjacent actors are expanding attacks on the foundational protocols of civilization, industrial control systems, and operational technology. The target is not the arsenal, it is the nervous system that commands it. The weapon is not an explosion, it is silence. Sever the primary undersea data cables. Blind the constellation of GPS and communication satellites. In a single, low-cost, and deniable operation, the global superpower is rendered deaf and blind. Its unmatched kinetic power, its fleets, its armies, its economic leverage, remains intact but inert. It becomes a blind leviathan, a colossal creature of immense strength, thrashing in the dark, unable to process, target, or respond with precision. This state of sensory deprivation creates a systemic solvency crisis. The state cannot prove who executed the attack, making a proportional response impossible. Yet, to do nothing invites a fatal perception of weakness, triggering a collapse of global confidence. The only remaining protocol is asymmetric escalation in a domain of absolute dominance, kinetic or economic. This transforms digital vulnerability into a direct vector for hot war. The motive is not aggression, it is solvency. A nation-state is considered solvent when its perceived power is greater than its domestic and foreign liabilities. When this ratio inverts, the state faces a strategic solvency crisis. The perception of weakness becomes a systemic liability, more dangerous than any foreign debt. This dynamic forces a state's hand, compelling it to act not out of choice, but out of a protocol for survival. Examine the Russian Federation. According to Forbes' analysis, the war was not just an invasion. It was a desperate gambit to manage a pre-existing solvency crisis. Faced with an unpopular war that was becoming a severe domestic liability, the Kremlin could not afford to absorb another strategic loss, especially a humiliating low-cost digital attack. The calculus became zero-sum. Any display of weakness would accelerate internal collapse. Weakness forces a pivot. This pivot is always asymmetric. When a superpower's conventional options are compromised, it cannot risk a proportional, tit-for-tat response to a deniable cyber event. Attacks on industrial control systems, AI, and OT infrastructure, as tracked by industrial cyber, create strategic paralysis. A symmetrical response is impossible. The only protocol to re-establish dominance and prove solvency is to escalate in a domain where victory is absolute, economic or kinetic. This is not a theory, it is a documented blueprint. When European opposition was framed as a challenge to a US objective, the response was not diplomatic negotiation. It was an immediate pivot to asymmetric economic warfare, the threat of a 25% tariff. This was followed by a psychological vector, the publication of a map depicting Canada and Greenland as US territory. The message is a protocol. A challenge will be met with overwhelming, disproportionate force in a domain of our choosing. The digitization of critical defense assets, such as the US missile defense program, creates the ultimate vulnerability. A breach there does not just represent a technical failure, it represents a fatal blow to strategic solvency. The attacked state, to avoid a death spiral of perceived weakness, will be forced to trigger the escalation protocol. The motive is to preemptively cauterize the wound of weakness with the fire of overwhelming force. This transforms a digital vulnerability into a direct vector for hot war. The central mechanism is economic. A report from the Royal United Services Institute, or USI, quantifies the new calculus of conflict. A $5 million main battle tank can be neutralized by a $500 first-person view drone. This is not a balanced equation, it is an economic inversion. The kinetic cost to liquidate a state's premier assets has collapsed by a factor of 10,000. This catastrophic cost asymmetry creates a condition analysts refer to as the democratization of violence. The term is clinical. It does not imply fairness. It describes the mass distribution of lethal capability. The barrier to entry for challenging a superpower's military hardware is no longer a shipyard or a factory floor. It is a credit card and an internet connection. This transforms expensive platforms from assets into systemic liabilities. Every deployed tank, every ship, becomes a high-value target for a low-cost, deniable attack. This is not a tactical problem. It is a solvency crisis for the entire military-industrial model. The math dictates that defending these assets becomes economically unsustainable. When a superpower cannot proportionally retaliate against a cheap, deniable strike without appearing weak, its only protocol is asymmetric escalation in a domain where it retains absolute dominance. The economic vulnerability of its legacy hardware becomes a direct vector for a disproportionate response, economic or kinetic. This is the blueprint. The math is irrefutable. The map of global instability is not a record of chaos. It is a blueprint. The travel warnings issued by the State Department for countries like South Africa are not humanitarian notices. They are markers for a new kind of battlefield. These zones of regional decay are the designated proxy laboratories for the next global conflict. Analysts at CSIS and Industrial Cyber confirm that hacktivist and state-sponsored cells are expanding attacks on industrial control systems, OT, and AI infrastructure within these gray zones. These are not random acts of vandalism. They are calculated probes, testing payloads against Western-built systems in environments where attribution is impossible and the rule of law has evaporated. This staging ground provides two critical assets: deniability and a live-fire environment. It allows an adversary to perfect a digital weapon that can trigger a systemic solvency crisis in a superpower without bearing the kinetic cost of a direct confrontation. The goal is not to win a war, but to make a superpower ungovernable from within by collapsing its critical functions. The liability vector extends to the highest levels of national defense. An Investing.com report confirmed Innodata, a data engineering firm, secured a contract on a U.S. missile defense program. The supply chain for our ultimate kinetic deterrent is now digitized. This transforms a software vulnerability into a direct threat to our launch-on-warning protocol. When a low-cost digital attack neutralizes a trillion-dollar defense system, a proportional response is mathematically impossible. The established protocol is asymmetric escalation. We've already seen the signals. The Truth Social post of a map showing Canada and Greenland absorbed into the U.S. is not policy, it's a threat display. It demonstrates the endgame. If our digital sovereignty is breached, we will use overwhelming economic and kinetic force to rebalance the ledger, treating sovereign borders as liabilities to be liquidated. The gray zone is simply where they test the key to that cage. The core protocol of nuclear deterrence is known as launch-on-warning. According to analysts at CSIS, this doctrine dictates that if early warning systems detect an incoming strategic missile attack, a retaliatory strike is launched before the incoming warheads can impact. There is no time to convene a committee. The decision is compressed into minutes. This protocol was designed for an analog world of radar and heat signatures. It is now a systemic liability. The digitization of command and control means the primary threat is no longer a missile. It is a line of code. The system's eyes and ears are now vulnerable. Reports from industrial cyber confirm that hacktivists and cybercriminals are actively expanding attacks on industrial control systems, operational technology, and AI. These are the exact systems underpinning critical defense infrastructure. The vector for a decapitation strike is now deniable and costs virtually nothing. This creates the fog of digital war. If a hostile actor blinds the radar, the commander faces a zero-sum choice. Is the blank screen a system error, a solar flare, or a cyber attack masking an inbound kinetic strike? The launch on warning protocol does not permit the luxury of waiting to find out. Waiting risks a successful first strike, a terminal solvency crisis from which the nation cannot recover. Launching based on a suspected digital ghost guarantees escalation. Corporate filings confirm the deep integration of this digital layer, with contractors like Innodata securing positions on U.S. missile defense programs. The attack surface is established. The commander is therefore forced to launch out of fear, not of the enemy's missiles, but of the ambiguity of their own data. The cyber attack doesn't need to destroy the hardware. It only needs to create enough doubt to trigger the irreversible protocol. This transforms digital vulnerability into a direct and mathematical vector for hot war. The next phase is not a declaration of war. It is a test of solvency. The blueprint is already public. Industrial cyber confirms hostile actors are expanding their targeting of industrial control systems and operational technology. This is the digital to physical gateway. It is the switch that turns a port crane into a multi-billion-dollar paperweight. Simultaneously, the strategic core continues its migration into this vulnerable domain. The contract position secured by Innodata on a U.S. missile defense program is not an isolated event. It is a symptom of total systemic integration. The same digital architecture managing logistics now underpins the kinetic kill chain. This digital dependency is now the primary vector for asymmetric leverage. Reports from CSIS and RUSI model the exact scenario, an attribution impossible event that paralyzes a critical economic node. It is a calibration shot. The objective is not destruction, but data collection, to measure the political response time, the attribution capability, and the threshold for economic pain before an escalatory protocol is triggered. The calibration forecast. Within the next 12 months, expect a cascading failure of the operational technology at a primary U.S. maritime logistics hub. The event will be framed as a sophisticated ransomware attack, providing perfect deniability. It will not be a hack, it will be a signal, testing the trigger point for a hot war.